The city of Seoul looked like a sea of diamonds from the top floor of the Soren Tower, but Mikhail Soren didn't care about the view. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection showing a man who looked more like a king than a businessman. At 46 years old, he was known as the Silver Fox of Seoul. His gray hair was swept back perfectly, and his full beard was trimmed with the kind of precision that cost more than most people made in a month. He wore a dark suit that fit him like armor, sharp and expensive, making him look both elegant and dangerous. In the world of high-stakes logistics and the city's hidden underground, Mikhail's word was the only law that mattered. He was famous for his cold efficiency and an iron-fisted rule that kept everyone in line. People didn't just respect Mikhail, they feared the silence that followed his name. He moved through his life with a detached brutality, treating people like pieces on a chessboard. To him, the thousands of employees who ran his ships, drove his trucks, and cleaned his many offices were invisible. They were just tools used to build his empire. Mikhail lived by a strict set of rules he called his code. He believed that power was about control, and that emotions were a weakness he couldn't afford. He had spent years building a reputation for being untouchable and heartless. He kept his private life a secret, hiding his past behind walls of money and influence. In his world, there was no room for mercy, only for results. Tonight was the annual Grand Gala, a night where the wealthiest people in the country gathered to celebrate their success. As Mikhail turned away from the window, he checked his gold watch. Everything had to be perfect. The music, the food, and the people served a purpose in his grand plan for the city's future. He walked toward the heavy oak doors of his office, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He was ready to play the role of the powerful leader once again, unaware that his ironclad reputation was about to be challenged by something as small as a piece of paper. Elena Petrova moved through the grand halls of the Soren Tower like a shadow. To the wealthy people who visited, she was just a girl in a black and white uniform, someone who filled water glasses and disappeared before they could even say thank you. For 3 years, Elena had worked as a maid to support her mother, Anya. They lived in a tiny apartment where the heater often broke, but as long as they had each other, Elena felt brave. However, for the last 3 weeks, that bravery had started to melt away. It began with a knock on their door that didn't sound like a friend. 2 men, tall and built like brick walls, had started showing up at their home. They were debt collectors, but they didn't carry official papers. They carried threats. They claimed Elena's father had left behind a debt that had grown far too large to pay. Elena knew her father had been a simple man, but these men didn't care about the truth. They only cared about the money. At first, they just stood outside and watched. Then, they started following Elena to the bus stop. "You work for the Silver Fox," one of them had whispered, his breath smelling of sour coffee. "He has plenty of money. Maybe you should find some for us." Elena had tried to ignore them, keeping her head down and her eyes on the ground. She thought that if she worked harder and stayed quiet, they would eventually go away. But the harassment grew worse. A week ago, they had pushed their way into the apartment while Elena was at work. They hadn't stolen anything, but they had turned over the furniture and broken her mother's favorite tea set. Anya had been shaking when Elena got home, her eyes wide with a fear that Elena had never seen before. "They said they're coming back, Elena," Anya had cried. "They said time is up." Elena felt trapped. She knew Mikhail Soren had a rule about his household. He didn't allow predators to hunt the people who worked for him. But how could a maid ever get close enough to speak to a man like that? He lived in a world of glass and gold, and she lived in the world of soap and scrub brushes. She was invisible to him. The final straw came the morning of the Grand Gala. Elena had been getting ready for her shift when she heard a crash from the kitchen. She ran in to find the 2 men holding her mother by the arms. They weren't just talking anymore. One of them had his hand raised, and Anya's face was bruised. Tonight, the lead man growled, looking at Elena. "If you don't bring us what we want from that tower, your mama won't be standing when you get back." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had no money to give them, and she would never steal from the Soren family. She had only one choice left, and it was the most dangerous one of all. She had to break the silence. As she arrived at the gala that evening, her hands were trembling so much she almost dropped her tray. In her pocket, she felt the small, crumpled piece of paper she had hidden there. She had used a pencil to scrawl 5 desperate words. "They're beating my mama." She watched Mikhail Soren from across the ballroom. He looked so tall and cold, surrounded by people who laughed and drank expensive wine. He looked like a man who had never been afraid a day in his life. Elena knew that if she failed, or if he was as heartless as people said, she and her mother were finished. She waited for her moment, watching for a gap in the crowd of billionaires. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was a daughter on a mission. As she stepped toward the most dangerous man in Seoul, she realized that being invisible was no longer an option. She had to make him see her, or lose everything she loved. The grand gala was a sea of sparkling lights and expensive perfumes, but for Mikhail Soren, it was just another night of being the most powerful man in the room. He stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by men in suits that cost a fortune and women wearing diamonds that caught the light of the massive chandeliers. To everyone there, Mikhail was the silver fox, a man who never showed a crack in his armor and whose cold, gray eyes seemed to see right through people. He nodded politely to a billionaire developer, his mind already moving to the next business deal, when he felt a slight brush against his arm. It was a quick, light touch, almost like a bird's wing. Mikhail looked down and saw Elena, the petite maid who usually moved through the penthouse like a ghost. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red as if she had been crying, but it was the way she looked at him that made his pulse skip a beat. She didn't look at him with the usual fear or respect. She looked at him with a desperate kind of bravery. Before he could say a word, she pressed a small, crumpled piece of paper into his hand and vanished back into the crowd of servants. Mikhail's first instinct was to drop the paper or hand it to his security team. He was a man of high status, and a mafia boss didn't take secret notes from the help in front of the city's elite. He felt the eyes of the other guests on him, and for a second, his pride told him to ignore it and keep smiling. But then, he felt the rough texture of the paper against his palm. Something about the look in Elena's eyes, the raw terror he hadn't seen in years, stirred a memory deep inside him. It reminded him of a time long ago, before the towers and the money, when he was just a boy watching his own mother struggle to survive in a world that didn't care about her. Turning slightly away from the billionaire he was talking to, Mikhail unfolded the note under the edge of a cocktail table. The words were scrawled in shaky pencil, but they hit him harder than any physical blow. "They're beating my mama." Suddenly, the music in the ballroom felt too loud, and the laughter of the guests sounded fake. Mikhail's jaw tightened, and his grip on the paper turned his knuckles white. He knew his reputation was built on being a man who stayed calm and never let his emotions get in the way of his business. Leaving the gala now would be a huge mistake for his image. It would show he could be distracted by something as small as a maid's problem. But his code was screaming at him. He had promised that the people under his roof were protected, and he realized that while he was sipping champagne, a predator was hunting in his own territory. The silver fox was at a crossroads. He could stay and protect his status, or he could follow the instinct that had once made him a leader people actually believed in. He looked toward the service doors where Elena had disappeared, then back at the glittering crowd. With a sharp breath, he made his choice. He didn't care about the million-dollar deals anymore. He walked away from the billionaire mid-sentence, his face turning into a mask of cold, focused rage that made the guests nearby step back in silence. The man who was supposed to be a heartless boss was now a man on a mission, and the gala was the last thing on his mind. Mikhail Soren stepped away from the sparkling lights and the sound of clinking glasses without saying a word to his guests. He pushed through a heavy set of double doors that most people at the gala didn't even notice. As the doors swung shut behind him, the music faded into a dull hum, replaced by the sterile smell of cleaning supplies and the hum of industrial fans. This was the world of the service stairs, the unpolished veins of the tower where the invisible people worked to keep his empire running. The transformation was immediate. The plush red carpets of the ballroom were gone, replaced by cold, gray concrete steps and yellowing walls. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, shaky shadows that danced against the metal railings. Mikhail loosened his expensive silk tie, feeling the weight of the crumpled note still pressed against his palm. Every step he took down the narrow staircase felt like he was traveling back in time, leaving the kingly silver fox behind and becoming the street-tough fighter he used to be. He descended quickly, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the stone. He didn't need a map. He could follow the trail of fear that Elena had left behind. On the landings, he passed a few other workers, a janitor with a mop and a young waiter carrying a heavy tray. They froze when they saw him. their eyes widening in shock to see the big boss in a place like this. Mikhail didn't look at them, but he noticed the way they shrunk back against the walls, trying to be as small as possible. It bothered him now, seeing how much they feared the man who was supposed to be their leader. As he reached the lower levels near the staff quarters, the air grew heavy and damp. The silence here wasn't peaceful, it was thick with tension. Mikhail stopped for a second, his ears ringing in the quiet, until he heard a muffled thud followed by a harsh, cruel laugh. It was coming from behind a plain gray door at the end of the hall. The kind of door he had walked past 1,000 times without ever wondering what was on the other side. His hand gripped the cold metal handle. He thought about his reputation and the fancy gala happening just a few floors above him. He knew that by opening this door, he was starting a war within his own organization. But the image of Elena's teary eyes and the memory of his own mother's struggles pushed him forward. Mikhail Soren, the man of status and gold, was gone. In his place stood a man ready to burn everything down to protect a woman he had never even met. He took a deep breath, his face turning into a mask of stone, and shoved the door open. Mikhail kicked the door open with a force that made the hinges scream. He stepped into the staff kitchen, a room filled with the smell of old grease and the sound of dripping water. The bright, cold light of the room showed a scene that made his blood boil. In the center of the room, two large men in dark jackets were standing over a woman who looked far too small and far too old to be in such a place. The two men were strong and built for violence. One of them had his hands clamped tightly onto the woman's shoulders, pinning her against a heavy wooden table. The other man stood right in front of her, leaning in close with a mean, jagged smile. This was Anya, Elena's mother. She was wearing a simple dress and a white apron that was now wrinkled and torn. Her face was pale, and a dark bruise was already forming on her cheek. She looked exhausted and terrified, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. "Where's the money, old woman?" The man in front mocked, his voice sounding like gravel rubbing together. He reached out and flicked her forehead, laughing as she winced. "Your daughter is up there serving champagne to billionaires. Don't you think she can spare a few coins to keep you safe?" The man holding her joined in the laughter, his grip tightening until Anya let out a small, pained cry. They were so busy enjoying their cruelty that they didn't notice the silver fox standing in the doorway. To them, this was just another easy job, another nobody they could break for a few dollars. They didn't realize that they had just broken the one rule that kept them alive. Mikhail's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, sharp rage. Seeing Anya, distressed, overwhelmed, and restrained by men he knew worked for him, shattered whatever was left of his calm. These men were supposed to follow his code, yet here they were, acting like the very predators he hated. He looked at Anya's trembling hands and her frightened face, and for the first time in 20 years, Mikhail felt a deep sense of shame. He had been so busy looking at the stars from his penthouse that he hadn't seen the monsters living in his own basement. The man in front raised his hand again, ready to strike, still mocking her with a low, nasty chuckle. "Maybe if we send a piece of you up to the gala, she'll listen faster," he sneered. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Mikhail said, his voice low and vibrating with a power that cut through the room like a knife. The two men froze. They turned slowly, their aggressive smiles fading into masks of pure shock. They recognized the sharp suit, the silver beard, and the cold, gray eyes immediately. They were looking at the man who owned the city, standing in a dirty kitchen with his knuckles white and his authority shaken by what he had found. The man holding Anya let go so fast it was as if her skin had turned to fire. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying, and for the first time, the two men realized that they were the ones who were now being hunted. Mikhail stepped into the center of the kitchen, his shadow stretching long and dark across the stained floor. The two men stood paralyzed, their faces pale under the flickering lights. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Mikhail didn't shout, he didn't have to. His presence was like a cold wind that froze everything it touched. He looked at the man who had been mocking Anya, a man named Victor who had worked for the Soren family for 5 years. Mikhail had trusted him to be a shield for the weak, but instead, Victor had become the monster. "Is this how you serve the household?" Mikhail asked, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the small room. He walked toward Victor, his expensive shoes crunching on a piece of broken porcelain from Anya's ruined tea set. Victor tried to speak, but his throat was so dry he could only make a clicking sound. He looked at Mikhail's eyes and saw something far more terrifying than a gun or a blade. He saw a man whose soul was on fire with a righteous anger. Mikhail's authority, once so calm and distant, was now sharp and dangerous. Before Victor could move, Mikhail reached out with a speed that blurred. He grabbed Victor by the collar of his jacket, lifting the large man nearly off his feet. The strength in Mikhail's hands was the strength of a man who had built an empire from nothing. He slammed Victor against the industrial refrigerator, the metal booming like a drum. The other man, the one who had held Anya, backed away into a corner, his hands trembling. He knew there was no escape from the silver fox when he was like this. "You took their money," Mikhail whispered, his face inches from Victor's. "You broke their home. You laid hands on a woman who feeds the very people you are paid to protect." Mikhail looked at the bruise on Anya's cheek, and his grip tightened until Victor's face turned a deep red. Mikhail wasn't just defending a maid's mother. He was dismantling the greed that had started to rot his own organization. He was proving that being the boss wasn't about the money in his bank account, but about the responsibility he held for every person who called his tower home. Mikhail let go, and Victor slumped to the floor, gasping for air. Mikhail turned his gaze to the second man, who was now sobbing quietly in the corner. Mikhail didn't feel pity. He felt a deep, cold disgust. "Get out," Mikhail commanded. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Leave your badges. Leave your weapons. If I see your faces in this city by sunrise, you will wish you had stayed in this kitchen." The two men scrambled up, not even bothering to look back as they fled through the service door, leaving the silence of the room behind them. The storm of rage in Mikhail's chest began to settle, leaving behind a heavy sadness. He turned to Anya, who was still leaning against the table, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. The boss of the city's underworld, a man who had stood before kings and billionaires, found himself feeling small as he looked at her. He realized that his power had been used for the wrong things for far too long. He reached out a hand, his fingers steady now, and gently touched the air near her shoulder, as if afraid he might break her. His authority had been shaken, but in that moment, as he chose to protect instead of destroy, it became stronger than it had ever been before. Mikhail stood in the center of the quiet kitchen, the sounds of the struggle still echoing in his mind. He looked at Anya, who was trembling so hard the wooden table rattled beneath her hands. The silver fox took a slow, careful step toward her, his shadow no longer looking like a threat. He saw a small smear of blood on her white apron, a bright red stain against the simple fabric that told a story of a woman who worked hard just to survive. "It's okay now, Sonora," Mikhail said, his voice softer than anyone at the gala would have believed possible. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her skin was rough and calloused from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes, a stark contrast to his own smooth, pampered hands. As he looked at her simple dress and that blood-stained apron, a memory hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't in a skyscraper anymore. He was a young boy again, watching his own mother come home with tired eyes and soap-reddened hands, wearing a dress almost exactly like Anya's. He realized then that he had spent so much time building a world of glass and gold that he had forgotten the people who actually held it up. Anya wasn't just a maid's mother. She was a reminder of where he had come from before he became a man people feared. He felt a deep pull of empathy, a feeling he had buried under layers of cold business deals for decades. He realized that while he had been protecting his status, he had allowed the very people he used to be hunted by the men he employed. Mikhail reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief. With a steady hand, he reached out and patted the small cut on her lip. Anya flinched at first, her eyes wide with lingering shock, but when she looked up and saw the genuine sadness in Mikhail's gray eyes, she finally let out a long, shuddering breath. She realized that the most dangerous man in Seoul wasn't there to hurt her. He was there to carry the weight she could no longer hold. "I am sorry," Mikhail whispered, and for the first time in his life, he meant it with his whole heart. "I forgot what it was like to be on this side of the door." He helped her sit down in a chair, staying by her side until the shaking stopped. The blood on her apron was a mark of his own failure, but as he looked at her, he made a silent vow that it would be the last time an innocent person bled in his house. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a man who had finally remembered his own name. Mikhail stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, watching Anya's breathing finally become steady. He realized that what he saw today was not just one mistake by two bad men. If Victor and his partner felt safe enough to attack a woman in the very building where the grand gala was happening, then the rot in his organization went much deeper than he thought. He had been so focused on high-level business deals that he had become blind to the bullies hiding behind his name. The Silver Fox was no longer just angry. He was determined to clean his house from top to bottom. He pulled out his encrypted phone and made a call to his most trusted lieutenant, Luca. When Luca answered, Mikhail's voice was as cold as ice, carrying a tone that meant heads were about to roll. "Stop everything," Mikhail commanded. "I want a full sweep of every debt collection team and every enforcement squad in the city. I want background checks on every man who has joined us in the last 2 years. If anyone has even looked at a family member of our staff the wrong way, I want them gone by dawn." Luca sounded surprised, as this was a massive job that would disrupt their usual business. But he knew better than to argue when Mikhail spoke with such absolute authority. Mikhail explained that they were no longer just looking for loyalty to the brand. They were looking for men who had lost their honor. He realized that his reputation for being heartless had accidentally invited predators to join his ranks, men who thought they could be cruel because the boss was cold. This internal purge was his way of showing that some lines could never be crossed, even for profit. As Mikhail walked back toward the service stairs, he saw his security teams already moving. They weren't heading to the gala to protect billionaires. They were heading into the streets to find the rogues. Mikhail felt a strange sense of relief as he watched them go. He knew this move might cause a coup or make his enemies think he was becoming weak, but he didn't care. He was willing to burn down the entire organization if it meant he could look at himself in the mirror again. The hunt for the predators had begun, and Mikhail Soren was leading the charge to make sure every invisible person in Seoul was safe once more. Mikhail walked back up the service stairs, his mind far away from the music and the fancy people waiting for him. When he stepped back through the heavy double doors into the grand ballroom, the room went quiet almost instantly. He was a sight that no one expected to see. His sharp dark suit was wrinkled, his silk tie was missing, and there was a dark smear of blood on his white shirt from where he had helped Anya. He looked like a man who had just come back from a war, and in a way, he had. The billionaires and city leaders stared at him in total shock, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their mouths. He didn't go back to his seat or try to hide the mess. Instead, he walked straight to the center of the stage where the band had been playing. He took the microphone, and the sound of his breathing filled the silent room. Mikhail looked out at his rivals, men who thought they were powerful because they had money, and he felt a strange kind of pity for them. They didn't understand that true power was about responsibility, not just being the boss. His authority had been shaken by what he discovered in the kitchen, but now, his purpose was clearer than it had ever been. "Tonight, the way we do business in this city changes," Mikhail said, his voice echoing off the gold-leafed walls. He didn't shout, but his words were heavy with a new kind of threat. He told the crowd that he had spent too long looking at the numbers, and not enough time looking at the people. He announced the Petrova Protocol, a new rule for his entire organization. From this moment on, anyone who worked for him was part of his family. Anyone who tried to bully or hurt the families of his workers would be hunted down by Mikhail himself. He made it clear that he was no longer just interested in profits. He was interested in honor. The room remained deathly quiet. His rivals exchanged nervous looks, their faces turning pale. They realized that the Silver Fox had become something far more dangerous than a cold businessman. He had become a man with a heart and a code, and that made him unpredictable. Mikhail looked down at his stained sleeve and then back at the crowd with a sharp, determined smile. He didn't care if they liked the new rules or if they thought he was losing his mind. He had rediscovered his roots, and he was ready to burn down any part of his empire that didn't live up to this new standard. He walked off the stage, leaving the elite of Seoul to wonder if they were still safe in a world where the most feared man had finally found his soul. The sun began to rise over Seoul, painting the glass towers in shades of pink and gold. But for the first time in his life, Mikhail Soren wasn't looking at the height of his buildings. He stood outside a quiet, sturdy brick house on the edge of a peaceful neighborhood, far away from the cold marble of his penthouse. Beside him stood Elena and Anya. Elena was no longer wearing her maid's uniform. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, and the look of terror in her eyes had finally been replaced by a weary sort of peace. Mikhail handed a set of silver keys to Anya, whose bruised face was beginning to heal. This house was a gift. A place where the doors had strong locks and the windows looked out over a garden instead of a dark alley. "This is yours now," Mikhail said, his voice steady and warm. "No one will ever knock on this door to frighten you again. My men are stationed at the end of the street, not to hunt, but to guard." Elena looked up at the silver fox and saw not a terrifying boss, but a man who had kept his word. She realized that her small, shaky note had done more than save her mother. It had changed the heart of the most powerful man in the city. Word of what happened at the gala spread through the streets of Seoul faster than a wildfire. In the crowded markets, the basement kitchens, and the late-night warehouses, people whispered about the boss who had walked away from billionaires to protect a maid. The story of the maid's note became a legend among the workers who usually felt invisible. They learned that Mikhail Soren was no longer just a tyrant to be feared, but a guardian who was finally watching over the people who built his world. Mikhail returned to his tower, but he didn't go back to his old ways. He spent his days dismantling the predatory loan rings and making sure his Petrova protocol was followed in every corner of the city. He knew that some of his rivals thought he was weak, but he felt stronger than ever. He had learned that true power wasn't found in how many people you could step on, but in how many people you could lift up. As he looked out at the city, he wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man with a soul, a neighborhood guardian who had finally found a reason to fight that was worth more than gold.